The first sound was a thing the ocean ate whole, a raw, hollow curl of voice that dissolved into the surf before it could land on anything solid. Camille felt that absence like a bruise. For a moment she imagined the sea swallowing not only sound but intent, swallowing the edge off a life that had grown sharp and public and exhausted. The seaplane hummed beneath her, prop wash breaking the sun into glitter. Below the island lay like a cut gem, rimmed with reef and palms, its beaches a smear of white. From above it read as promise. She had wanted promise, or at least silence. Camille Laurent sat with her hands folded in her lap, the private cabin air smell of citrus and antiseptic. Her dresses had been left at the villa. Her phone was locked in a small, soft case, its screen dimmed to nothing. The headlines that had followed her for months, a scandal here, a rumor there, had the quality of a storm she no longer trusted herself to navigate. The island was a private refuge, booked under a shell company, a place made to be invisible to the kind of attention that had hollowed her out. Adrian Vale, the resort manager, had framed it as a neutral space. No photographers, no social events, a place to vanish in comfort. Camille liked the idea of vanishing. She liked the soundlessness of the word. Adrian met her on the dock with the practiced ease of someone who had spent the shape of his days learning how to make people feel they were the only thing in the room. He was almost too neat, sleeves rolled to the same length, shoes with just the right weathering, a smile that polished concern into hospitality. He took her bag. He did not ask about the scandal, and she was grateful for the omission, like the relief when a wound stopped being prodded. The villa was a curated solitude. Whitewashed walls, floor-to-ceiling glass that opened to the sea, linens folded into tidy rectangles. Everything was on the right side of luxury so that discomfort would not have to linger. The staff moved through the property like memory, efficient, polite, careful not to startle. Yet in their gestures there was something held back, as if they were reluctant to give the island itself any more voice than it already had. On her first evening, the sunset bled into the water in improbable ways, long strokes of orange and mauve. Camille walked the beach barefoot, the sand cool beneath her feet. The place felt designed to be adored. A string quartet would not have seemed out of place. A camera crew could have made it look like an advertisement for a life she had played at but never kept. Instead, there was the sound of waves and far-off gulls, and beneath those, a thin, steady pulse of something that made the air taste metallic. She told herself it was seaweed or tide, or the way a new place always felt slightly uncanny at the edges. She told herself many things. At the villa, a decorative bowl of shells sat on the entry table. 2 shells had been laid on their edges like small pale eyes. It made her smile, absurdly, until she realized the shells were placed with exactness, 3 degrees apart, an order to their arrangement that suggested hand. She could not say why that small thing lodged in the base of her throat and would not move. That night, the house lights drew long theatrical shapes on the terrace, and the candles flickered to illusion. The staff had been given instructions that came from a manual of discretion. Stock the fridge, leave the blinds open during the day, never knock before midnight. The words seemed excessive until she met the old woman in the market. Camille had gone into the village to buy fruit and to be, briefly, an unremarkable presence. The market was as rustic as she expected. Woven baskets, piles of citrus, fishermen mending nets. The old woman stood by a stall of dried herbs. Her skin was the color of driftwood. Her hair had gone the color of wind. She watched Camille with a steady gaze, and then, when Camille reached for a bunch of green, the woman said, in a voice that lived halfway between a statement and a conserving whisper, "Do not let it have you alone after night." Camille smiled, the polite, slightly patronizing smile that had been honed for conservative charity dinners and awkward interviews. She counted with the kind of reassurances she could give herself. There was staff, cameras, guests, rules. The woman's eyes did not soften. "It will watch what you bring," she said. It takes what comes empty. The phrase settled in Camille the way a cold wind settles in a house. She tried to translate its geometry into logic. Take what comes empty. Was this about grief? About someone's hunger? She had come empty in certain ways. She had come to escape noise and to avoid intimacy, to be seen but not known. For a long time, her solitude had been a performance, the careful arrangements of a life noticed without being probed. Now it felt precarious. The second morning, as the villa filled with an ordinary shimmering sunlight, the island offered apologies. The palm fronds glittered. A staff member left a paper bag of croissants on the table, and the ocean was a flat, generous sheet. Under that light, the old woman's warning seemed like superstition. The ocean hummed as if to say, "Look, this is beauty." Camille lay on a chaise and let the brightness lap over her like hope. Daytime here bathed everything in forgiveness. Yet the island had two faces, and its other one belonged to night. Night began with small betrayals. On her first dusk, Camille noticed footprints where there should have been none. A succession of pale prints across the villa's terrace, each one glossy with a water that did not seem to dry. They led to the sliding glass of her bedroom and stopped there, perfect, unchanged despite the sun and the wind. She bent to touch one, and her fingers came away damp with salt, but not sand. The print left no smear on her skin. When she turned to call someone, she glimpsed through the glass the suggestion of a hand laid wide and slow on the outside. Its fingers splayed like the fingers of a palm leaf. She reflexively jerked back from the pain as if touched. When she threw the curtains open, the prints were gone. The terrace looked untouched, as if someone had walked on air and the island had forgiven them. The absence of proof irritated her more than fear did. It felt like the island asserting its own authority. You may look, but you will never own my evidence. That night she slept badly, waking to the sound of 3 measured taps on glass. The taps were crisp, deliberate, 1, 2, 3, and came from the direction of the balcony. She stayed frozen beneath the covers, and the house made itself small around her. The taps repeated again and again, rhythmically. The third tap she could not name as the worst. It was the way the taps climbed into her chest and settled there, an insistence that would not be comforted. Camille forced her hands to calm. She flicked the bedside lamp on and sat, breathless, until the light ruined the thing outside the window into a thing that could be denied. There was nothing. A little smudge of sea spray on the pane. The glass, when she pressed her hand to it, gave warmth. The taps could have been wind. They could have been a branch. Anything that gave her less weight to bear than the idea that she had been noticed and not invited inward. In the mornings, the cameras told a different story. The security system, a neat bank of screens in the manager's office, cheerfully showed the exterior. The beach at dawn, the plunge pool glistening, a dog that was occasionally allowed out for exercise. Yet in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, the monitors produced only static or black frames. The staff explained this away with technicians and maintenance. Sometimes the marine weather created interference, they said. The old woman had not mentioned cameras. That detail, failure of the watchful eyes, sat among the rest of the island's concessions like a small, unglossed tooth. Adrian, who managed courtesy as a kind of armor, watched Camille with the same careful attention the cameras did not provide. He offered explanations like salves. The cameras, he said, were prone to glitches during electrical storms. The island's signal drifted with the tide. He did not use the word midnight. He did not need to. People on islands become storytellers, or they become quiet. There is rarely much in between. The guests, at first amiable, began to fray at the edges. One man spent his afternoon standing at the far end of the beach, looking out to sea, until his shoulders set in a way that suggested he was holding some distance between himself and the rest of the world. A young couple kept to the pool, speaking in low voices. A woman screamed once in the night and then did not leave her room for 2 days. Conversations at dinner became guarded. People skirted around subjects like deep water. The island's hush worked from the outside in. Camille's nights found new shapes. She woke to the sensation of breath against her neck, though the air was still and the villa door was latched. Once, when she leaned over the balcony ledge, she saw pale figures at the waterline, standing statue-still with their faces to the dark ocean. They were too thin to be human in the way her eyes tracked them. They were long and aquiline, like eels that thought in bone. In the daylight, their places were empty, sand unmarked. At night they were there, like the recurrence of a nightmare made of tide and patience. She began to leave doors unlocked, as if preparing an experiment. She kept small notebooks, notes for herself in precise handwriting about when she heard knocks, what time they happened, whether the cameras showed anything before the freeze. Each time the monitors glitched between midnight and sunrise, they blacked out with the same minor mercy. The screens would die. The staff offered to reset them. Resetting did nothing that lasted. What worried Camille most was not the lack of images, but how the island folded evidence into doubt. It gave her the sensation of being gaslit by place itself. When a guest claimed to have woken with wet footprints leading away from his bed toward the sea, other guests nodded and then cast down their eyes. The island did not allow for a neat narrative. It offered only a pattern you could read if you looked long enough. The motif of a creature that preferred dawn to be the boundary of its law. The old woman reappeared, sometimes sitting on a low wall near the market, shell bracelets on her wrists. She would nod to Camille without greeting. Once, handing her a wrapped slice of mango that tasted of the sun and salt, she said, "You brought a silence. It will measure what you keep of it." Camille wanted that silence at first, the way one wants dessert after a heavy meal. It was a place to rest between performances. But as days narrowed into weather and stunted conversation, she felt the silence turn back on her, a kind of mirror that reflected the hollows she'd smoothed over in public. Alone, she felt the weight of her emptiness the way one feels the depth of a cold pool when you stand at its edge and stare down. There was a hunger to it, and she had the odd private dread that it was a thing with its teeth. She found herself watching people more than being seen. Watching was an occupation she had left behind in a life of lenses and parties, a pastime that was now a necessity, to gauge gestures, to find fissures in mask. In the evenings she took to walking the perimeter of the resort, a circular route lit by discreet lamps, one trailing poolside, another by the palms. She liked to imagine the path had a geometry she could learn, that if she walked it enough, the island would be mapped by her feet and safe by familiarity. The island was not a city. It did not require maps. It required deference. On the 5th night, she dreamed of an altar. In the dream, she was underground in a cavern that smelled of copper and old rain. Stones were stacked into a ring. Inside the ring, small bones were arranged in a sunburst, the color of bone but not precisely human. Water pooled at the base. Voices hovered like moths at a lamp, saying nothing she could record but feeling like accusations. She woke with the memory lodged between her shoulder blades, the ache of it like an old bruise. The storm began 2 days later, not with bravado, but with a patient updraft. Clouds rolled in like a hand being placed across the sun. The staff tightened their schedules. The island, which had seemed to hold itself like a promise in daylight, took on the feel of a thing weathered into something older. Adrian's manner changed minutely. He stopped smiling in places where he used to. His answers became shorter. It was during the storm that the first camera showed a face. Camille had spent the afternoon in the manager's office with a cup of tea left cold on the table. She had not intended to be there, but the world had shrunk to the size of grainy monitors and Adrian's neat desk. In one small instant between the swell of static, when the monitors blinked and tried to settle on the night's feed, she saw a pale shape in a frame. A face perhaps, but not entirely face. The mouth was a bracket of shadow. The eyes were long and vertical, like fish gills. It smiled in something that might have been mimicry, and then the screen went to black with a soft, obscene finality, like someone had closed a book on the thing. Adrian shrugged and said something about power surges. His hands did not quit their coffee cup. He told her, with an economy of word that sounded like an attempt at professional kindness, that the island had weather problems. Monitoring equipment was older than it should be. He did not tell her that staff sometimes left the beach at night to stand and count waves, that a previous manager had resigned suddenly and left a note of apology, that the insurance man who came once had pretended to be cheerful when he left. That evening the knocks happened again, only now the tapping seemed to come from multiple places. A thin rapping at the kitchen panel, a precise triple at a far window, the hollow rhythm of fingernails against a wooden chair. In the kitchen a bowl of fruit had been tipped over, so the mangoes rolled like small suns across the tile. The staff blamed the wind. The fruit had not ripened enough to drop on its own. Camille sat in the dark and listened. Rain stitched the air into a thin living cloth. The knocks threaded through it like a sewing needle. She thought of the old woman's words, of the way the island watched what you brought. A syllable of fear, not acutely sharp, but a slow spread of cold, moved behind her breastbone. She had come to be unseen. It felt suddenly like the bravest kind of exhibition, to be noticed by whatever this was. On the sixth night, something pressed its hand against the other side of glass. It was not a tap. It was a deliberate flat palm that left a wet print against the pane. The print was not like a human palm. It was longer, narrower, the fingers the width of thin branches. The wetness did not slide as it might on ordinary glass. It clung, the way salt stains cling. She could see the ridges where the creature's palm had pressed, as though the creature wanted to leave the faintest autograph of its existence, and then had been satisfied. She pressed her own hand to the glass and felt a jolt of cold, like a circuit. When she drew back, there was the whisper of salt on her skin, and the print would not be rubbed away. She kept notes. The list grew into a small ledger. Date, time, occurrence. It felt ridiculous and also absolutely necessary. Footprints at 1:13 a.m., 3 taps at 2:07 a.m., monitor failure 12 of 58, 4:22, wet palm at 3:01. She could not sleep for the ledger itself, the act of writing a defense. Neighborhoods of the staff began to hold more gossip, moving like crabs under rock. A junior girl spoke in a low, urgent tone to Camille at breakfast about men she had seen on the shoreline who simply stood and watched the sea as if waiting for something to arrive to them. Another employee, a man who stocked the bar, told her that sometimes the island's tide brought odd things, a child's shoe, a length of rope. He did not laugh about it. He did not smile. Camille's curiosity hardened into a lucid, stubborn purpose. She wanted to document the island's grammar. She wanted to prove either that she was frightened by her own imagination, or that something real lived at the edges of the resort. If she learned the pattern, if she learned the rhythm of the knocks, the places where prints appeared, she thought she could make the island legible and therefore manageable. She would make a map. She would wait. The idea of designing a defense against a place felt perversely like self-care. Adrian watched this development with a look that was respectful and wary. He suggested one evening that perhaps Camille should stay in the main lodge for the next few nights. He said the beachfront villas were more exposed. His voice did not carry the sweetness of suggestion. It carried a coolness, as if he were pointing out a practical fact about weather and tides. She did not tell him that she suspected he was trying to move her into a position where he could keep his eyes on her. She thanked him and declined. Of all the stages of invisibility she had inhabited, being watched under the pretense of protection was the most insistent. 2 nights later, she walked the path behind the villas, lantern in hand, though the staff had told her not to wander at night. The storm had not yet broken. The clouds were only a bruise on the horizon. The lamps along the path threw cones of light that stopped short of the jungle. The interior of the island beyond the lamps was a black mouth, promising depth. Camille moved because the question of seeing crept like a burn in her mind. What did it mean to be observed when you had practiced observation as a kind of armor? She found a figure at the edge of the trees, not one of the guests, not a staffer. The old woman sat on a fallen root like part of the tree itself. Her shell bracelets made a soft sound when she shifted. She offered no greeting. She had a stick of something fragrant in her hand that sent a thin beam of smoke into the night. "You will not be left alone if you ask to be," she said without looking at Camille. The sentence had no accusation. It was a statement of natural law. Camille had the foolish, immediate urge to tell the woman that she had not asked to be left. The next part came softly, so low that Camille had to lean forward to hear it. "It does not hunger for meat," the woman said. "It eats the quiet." Camille thought of the ledger, of the prints that did not wash away. She thought of the hollow sound the ocean made when a cry went missing. She sat with the old woman until the smoke thinned and the sky scraped open. In the dim, the woman's hand found hers, and for a moment, a small human contact. The island's intent felt distant. The woman did not speak of cures. She did not offer safety. She spoke like one who maps logic without trying to change it. A week in, suspicion hardened into action. Camille would not wait for the island to name her. She wanted to find the altar from the dream. She wanted to see the bones as described in the rumor thread that swam in hushed conversations and frightened smiles. Adrian advised caution with the placid tone he used for weather advisories and hoarse-whispered hospitality. The staff told stories low and careful, never fully given. They did not say that this had happened before, only that the island had its ways and sometimes people left changed. The phrase changed was practical and slippery. She spent an afternoon in what the resort liked to call the security hub, a compact room on the ground floor of the operations building, screens mounted like eyes. The air smelled of old electronics and boiled coffee. The screens showed non-spectacular footage, an empty path, a sunlit beach, a guest walking toward a palm. At the bottom right of one screen, a timestamp ticked in neat blue numbers. Camille watched the clockwork of pixels and felt the same childish hope she used to feel waiting for a camera shutter to capture truth. At 11:46 p.m., a frame flickered. For 3 frames, 2, really, the feed showed something moving across the rim of the shore. Then, the image melted into static, like spilled ink. When the monitors rebooted an hour later, the frames were black for the time between. She replayed, rewound, slowed. The footage refused to yield. There was the ghostly suggestion of a limb, an elbow gone too long and thin, and then nothing. The recorder's log showed an abrupt loss of signal at 11:47 and a return at 4:12 a.m. The log, like the island, preferred intervals. The implication tightened something in Camille's chest. Between midnight and dawn, the island anonymized itself, blanking the cameras as if to sweep away its own fingerprints. She felt the delicious, horrible clarity of someone looking at a map with a route of danger highlighted and making the decision to walk it. She left the hub with a plan that made practical sense and emotional sense in equal measure. She would document. She would perch the cameras she had brought, a compact, reliable model she had used on shoots, in places words might not reach. She would stand watch. She would not be a passive witness. The team that had installed the network performed their work with the slow hands of men who had done this before. They taped one small camera to the veranda rail and another to the underside of a palm. The devices were childlike against the size of the night. They looked inadequate in the way that hope sometimes does. The storm finally came with full attention 2 nights later. Rain arrived like an accusation, not gradual but immediate, a curtain dropped in a single gesture. The wind had the voice of a thing that knew the island's names and spoke them out as it rearranged roofs and palms. The villa's lights flickered and held like small candles against a black that had weight. The cameras, respectful of their pattern, went almost immediately to black at the stroke of midnight. Camille sat on the terrace with a raincoat and the odd, shivering equipment of vigilance. The monitor she had pressed into action on her own feed showed only a grainy view of the wet terrace. The other cameras, the resort's, were mute. The night was a patient beast. The ocean's voice grew into a kind of hymn. At 2:07 a.m., the triple knock sounded across the villa, precise as a clock. The taps echoed against the glass, carrying the damp smell of salt and rain. She rose so quickly that a candle sputtered. When she opened the door, there was nothing on the terrace but slick boards and the track of a single set of footprints leading away into the wet sand, away toward the sound of the waves. They were not the footprints of a human. The toes were long and tapered, the arches were high. The prints remained unaffected by the rain, the way something stubborn in the island refused to be erased by weather. She stepped out barefoot into the rain and followed. The footprints went toward the shoreline and then into the surf, where the tide closed around them without filling them in. The water moved like a hand that did not want to spoil the memory of anyone's passing. Camille followed until the sand was ankle-deep. The prints stopped at the edge of the water, ending as if the owner had stood looking out and then simply dissolved into patience. The ocean answered everything by being bigger. She turned to go back, and a movement at the edge of the trees made her stop. A figure watched her from the dark, pale against the leaves. It was not tall, and yet it had an elongation she could not name. Too thin, the limbs long in a way that made angles where there should not have been angles. For a breath, she felt as if it was only a trick of light. Then it shifted and the palms moved like a hand releasing a breath. Camille felt the old woman's voice in her ears. It eats the quiet. She felt the sea, the camera's blind spot, the ledger of events she had begun to compile. She realized with a neatness that scared her that there was a difference between being alone and being empty. She took a step back, and the figure did not move further away. For a moment it seemed to tilt its head as if listening to something that was not rain. Then it turned and walked along the shore, leaving prints that did not blur with tide. Camille's feet sank into the wet sand, and for once she had no plan as to what to do. She was not brave in the mythic way. She was simply someone who had refused to be a passive witness for too long. She watched it go until the shapes of palm and stone swallowed the figure. The rain masked the sound, and the sea made a constant, forgiving roar. At dawn, the island became the thing it offered to strangers. Light poured over leaves, the terrace was dry, and the footprints were gone. Cameras came back alive with an apologetic hum. The staff moved with the casual competence of those who had mended the same things too many times to be surprised. There were explanations, minor technical ones that fit together like a rickety bridge. Adrian offered Camille a coffee with his hand resting for a second too long on the counter, an almost gesture of concern that did not become confession. He said nothing about the figure she had seen. In daylight, Camille caught herself looking for the shape again, all the way to the waterline where the ocean looked like glass and the sky an unembarrassed blue. The island's daylight was a coat of varnish. It made the bones beneath appear less sharp. It was salvation and trick. She found herself both relieved and enraged by the daily erasure. Were the prints gone? Or had the island simply chosen to spare her the proof? There was a small, bitter part of her that wanted some relentless clarity, a permanent scar she could point to and name. She had come to be unseen. Instead, the island had taught her the uglier possibility that she could be seen too well, noticed by a gaze that read her quiet as invitation. She wondered which hunger was worse. When the staff mended the cameras that morning, they did it with the same clinical efficiency as men who patch holes in a boat's hull. They wrote reports on clipboards. They said the power grid had hiccuped. Someone suggested that the storm had stirred something up in the reef that interfered with the satellite. No one said that the cameras always died in the same small window between midnight and sunrise. That would require the island to have a schedule. That would require a pattern. Camille returned to her villa and sat with the ledger, the page damp where her fingers had smudged the ink. She wrote a line and then crossed it out. She found that her handwriting changed, as if it were translating to another language the longer she stayed. The letters tightened and then unraveled. She had thought to find silence, and instead discovered a grammar she did not recognize. It had gestures and rituals, and she suspected appetites. She slept fitfully that afternoon in the bright heat, and dreamed a second time of an altar that sat in a ring of stones by water black as old grief. The dream left the taste of metal in her mouth. When she woke, she made coffee and watched the horizon where the sea met sky and felt the unnerving sense of being observed, not by a person with eyes, but by a thing that catalogued absence. By the end of the week, the other guests had begun to leave in trickles. A couple checked out early, offering polite halves of explanations. The woman who had screamed took her bags and moved to the lodge and then to a plane that left at first light. A hush grew among the residents like a new weather system. Adrian's face took on the same tightness everyone wore when they kept accounts of small terrors. Camille paradoxically stayed. She found that the distance between ignorance and knowledge had become a territory she could not abandon. She would not leave until she had either proof to lay on a table and say plainly, "This is what happened," or until the island owned her in some other, clearer way. There was a stubbornness in her that had once made her a darling of cameras. Now that stubbornness kept her to the shore. The old woman came by the villa before dawn, the day of the storm's fuller return. She did not knock. She stood at the threshold with a small, crusted bowl balanced in her hands. "People will leave listening for what is polite to say," she told Camille. She pushed the bowl forward. Inside were fragments of bone so small, Camille wondered if they were from birds. She held them without flinching. "You want to know what it eats?" she said. "You will not like the answer." She did not wait for Camille to offer thanks, and in the next breath tilted her head like she was listening to something far away. The old woman's eyes shone wetly. "Things that listen never want to be alone," she said, and then she turned and walked back into the night. Camille held the bowl for a long moment. The fragments were cold. She thought of the ledger, of the cameras, of the prints that did not blur with tide. She thought of the phrase, "eat the quiet," and felt a logic assembling like hidden bones. She had come to the island to be unseen, to be still, to taste silence. The island had accepted that invitation and had shown her a cost. Outside, the ocean breathed its habitual hungry rhythm. Rain began again in a slow march, each drop making a small drum on the veranda. The sky tightened. By midnight, the monitors were black. By 1 a.m., the knocks began, precise as a metronome. Camille sat very still and watched, feeling the old animal part of herself that had once loved being looked at begin to narrow. She had asked for refuge. The island's reply was a kind of consideration that asked for something of equal weight in return. There was a sound then, not the triple knocks, but a softer thing, like wet sand being sifted through fingers. It came from the direction of the jungle. Camille rose because the shape of her will had reached its limit. She took a flashlight and moved out into the rain. The storm had a voice that wrapped itself around her. The path glistened. The flora smelled of brine and crushed leaf. The light beam cut through the dark like a small, frightened animal. Where the lamp touched, things were ordinary. A fern, a moss-mittened rock, the path slick underfoot. Beyond that, the trees made a wall of depth. She followed the noise, which grew into a pattern of wet sounds and then began to weave into the susurration of whispering leaves. The flashlight did not reveal an altar or bones. It showed for a moment something pale between the trunks. A limb, perhaps, or a face. And then the beam wanted another thing and left the image with the same polite cruelty the island had used earlier in daylight. Camille felt like a traveler who had been given the wrong key over and over. Each lock opened a little, just enough to be tempted. She kept moving. In a small clearing, the ground was collapsed into a ring of stones, half swallowed by roots. Moss covered them in places. In the center lay things like small white seeds. She could not bring herself to call them bones at first. The word felt too large and precise. They were fragments, bleached, arranged like offerings. Salt had crystallized in the hollow of the stones. Water pooled black, reflecting the sky like a lens. She knew in the immediate acid certainty of someone who has always known when loneliness will betray them, that she had found one of the island's altars. She took a step closer, and the hair on her arms rose. The wind held its breath. Beyond the ring, in the dark mouth of the trees, she could make out the suggestion of figures at the margin of sight, pale, long, watching. None moved to approach. None needed to. They were the island's witnesses. Camille's chest tightened until it hurt. She thought of how she had come to the island, folded into linen, private, seeking silence. The ring of stones made silence into a thing given to ritual. It made her emptiness look like food. She wanted, absurdly, to call for Adrian. But the voice she imagined in the trees answered instead, like something that had learned to mimic and had not yet learned to smile. The voice was not a voice so much as a modulation of air, a brine-salted syllable that suggested meaning without committing to it. It said something like, "You took the quiet." It tasted of her own habitual silences. Camille wanted to retort with what she always said to the world, "I am not empty," but the sound stuck in her like a pebble. She thought of the ledger, of the child's shoe the staff had once found, of the man who watched the sea until he became part of the horizon. She thought of being noticed by a gaze that asked for what she had always withheld. A wind moved through the clearing. The figures at the tree line became mere shadow. Rain softened the edges of things. She realized with an unwanted clarity that whatever had been watching had not come to the clearing to hunt meat. It had come to recognize what she had brought with her into the island's small court. She shone the light through the ring and saw in the glisten at the water's edge reflections like eyes. The beam trembled in her shaking fingers. From somewhere deep in the trees, she thought she heard the faintest thing that might have once been laughter. The island does not hurry, she understood, not as metaphor but as fact. It waits. It keeps its hours. Camille felt the ground shift under her boots, the kind of shift that means a decision is being asked. She stepped backward and then, as if a tether had been cut, she turned and ran. Her return to the villa was a blur of rain, of palms struck by wind, of the small hush of animal sounds. Behind her, somewhere within the island's shadow, things moved with the soft economy of creatures that do not waste energy. She slammed the door, locked it, and slid down to the floor, breath heaving, her legs weak. The ledger was on the table, its pages damp. She closed it with trembling fingers and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Dawn, when it came, arrived like a soft forgiveness. Light filled the villa with the untroubled certainty of a child. The ring of stones at the clearing might have been a set of gullies. The bones might have been shells. The footprints might have been some trick of tide. The cameras, obedient at last, offered images of a wet terrace and one stray bootprint that the tide had almost, but not quite, taken away. It was as if the island offered daylight as both grace and rebuke. Camille sat in the sun, with coffee steaming in her hands, and felt the strange split of relief and exposure. She had been seen, and yet the island had chosen to erase the evidence that would make the seeing useful in any practical way. The ledger felt both necessary and absurd, and she turned the page to find that each line she had written now read like a sentence in a foreign language. Her phone buzzed with a message from a friend in town. It was banal. It asked if she was eating. She did not answer. She realized she had begun to move through the day measured against the ledger, the knocks, the way the cameras obeyed sleep but failed at wake. She found herself translating ordinary minutes into potential evidence. A knock at 2 in the morning became a small fact. A wet smear on the glass became a paragraph. Routine shrank into a system of checks. Did the monitors die at the appointed hour? Were there footprints at dawn? Had anyone else noticed the way the island held its breath before it acted? The measure gave her a kind of agency. It also made her nights narrower. A soft, intrusive thought crept in whenever she sat with the pages. Perhaps the island would not only test her, perhaps it wanted to own what she brought with her. The old woman's words, "It eats the quiet," spooled around the thought like a thread. If the island fed on absence, what would it do with a person who had practiced appearing without being known? The question had the coldness of a blade. Her life had been composed of surfaces that reflected light without depth. The island had shown her that surfaces could be consumed. She began to prepare with the stubborn exactness of someone who had once staged entire photo shoots down to the last candle. She took the cameras she had brought and set them where human planning could still matter, aimed at the terrace, pointed toward the stretch of sand where figures tended to stand, clipped beneath the eaves toward the path into the trees. She charged batteries in the little kitchen like a priest kindling votive lights. Tape wrapped over lenses, tarpaulin-shrouded devices. A tripod stood like a makeshift altar. She labeled things in the ledger as if a catalog could anchor a truth. Adrian watched these preparations and met them with a civility that seemed arranged to be unobtrusive. He leaned against the doorway of the operations room and offered one small concession. If she intended to be out at night, to take company. He did not press the request into an order. There was the professional cadence of a man who had learned to keep hospitality's edges soft. Camille declined, insisting on autonomy with a voice that supplied a brittle laugh. She would go alone. The sort of loneliness she carried had a strange pride about it. To let someone see panic would have been a further exhibition. The staff murmured like an undersong to her resolve. A young maintenance man, someone whose hands were perpetually dusted with salt and circuitry, slid her a small headlamp and the exact words, "Be careful, but not with pity." The phrase was offered the way one hands over a map. Camille accepted the lamp because the act of accepting felt, in its smallness, like reclaiming the power to move. The storm returned with appetite that time. It took over the island not in stages, but with abruptness, as if impatient with the polite calendar of weather. Rain found the roofs like someone rubbing their fingers across a page. The wind braided itself into tree limbs until the palms sounded like ropes singing. The midnight between the storm's first shout and its broader feast was when the island's behavior hardened into law. The monitors fell silent, and the world itself narrowed to the rules the place kept. She left the villa with the tap of the headlamp and the camera warm against her chest. The path was slick. Each step made a small complaint in the night. The lamp's circle moved ahead, illuminating wet leaf and broken shell. Close to the beach, the sound of the surf grew into a white noise that filled her ears like a memory. Camille kept her pace even, breathing against the cold that ran along her forearms. She followed the footprints again, the same elongated pattern from earlier, a line that argued with the tide and refused to be washed. They threaded toward the trees and then dove where shore met root. Following them was not a heroic thing, it was an insistence. Proof had become a talisman she believed would restore some portion of control. The clearing lay ahead like a wound. Lantern light made the ring of stones shimmer. Rain ran in black stitches across the field. In the center, the small white fragments gathered their scattered light and turned it into meaning. They were bones, Camille allowed herself to think. Small, old, bits worked into an arrangement that made ritual of loss. She knelt on sodden earth and the rain filled the hollow of her cheeks. The bone fragments were not human in a way that allowed simple denomination. They sat like the residues of many kinds of absence. There were more things here than the stones could justify. Shells threaded on a string, a length of thin rope coiled like a sleeping snake. A smear of something that had once been placed with deliberation and then left to harden. The altar did not scream its purpose, it suggested. Its restraint made what it meant more precise. Camille felt, rather than saw, the shift at the tree line. A tightening of attention, the sense of being catalogued. Figures moved at the periphery, not stepping fully into light, but their presence made the edges of the clearing feel occupied. The lamp's glare made pale reflections in the wet of their skin. The creatures were not human in proportion, limbs extended with a wrong elegance, fingers tapered into thin branches. They watched as people sometimes watch a performer, keen, without the social padding that might include empathy. Something spoke then, or rather the air modulated and speech arrived like the water in the gutter of a roof. It was not a mouth, so much as a chorus of impressions layered into words, as if several voices were speaking through the throat of a single thing. You came empty, it said, with a sound like kelp dragged along stone. Camille's throat closed. The words lay over her like a diagnosis. Empty opened on her, like a door she had been trying to keep shut. She had rehearsed denials. I'm not empty. I've always been seen. I know how to perform. But the syllable hollowed out the excuses. The creature's voice was not cruel. It was precise. It knew. There was an odd comfort in being known. The feeling arrived with the helplessness of confession. The lead figure stepped forward then, not in a way that suggested haste, but with the measured approach of tide. Its face, if face can be called that, suggested many things at once. A fish that had tried on a human smile, a skull softened by salt. Its eyes were long and vertical, the way gills run along an animal's flank. When it moved, the air around it smelled faintly metallic, like pennies left in a bowl. Camille raised the camera on instinct, the lens catching a wet reflection. For an instant, 2 blinks, the creature's face fractured into something human, the suggestion of recognition, an echo. It spoke again, but the sound was not a single voice. It overlapped in layers like voices in a shell. It said, "You brought the quiet." It tasted like an unplucked thing. The creature's phrasing carried no moralizing. It was an observer making notes. Camille felt absurdly that she had undergone a cultural translation and failed. She wanted to explain the veneer of public life, the obligations, the performance that had become a substitute for intimacy. But words felt small and theatrical against such an audience. Instead, she spoke the only truth she had rehearsed for herself. I came to be alone. The sentence sounded both like a plea and a dare. The creature's head tilted. The breeze shifted and the rain lightened into a whisper. For a moment, all the peripheral figures stilled as if the island itself tuned to the exchange. The lead creature leaned in, as if listening to a rhythm the human ear could not pass. It spoke in a tone that suggested neither victory nor pity, but the currency of things that count loss. It said, "You can leave the wanting to us. There is no ache so clean." The offer was a kind of mercy dressed as hunger. It proposed an end to the ache, surrender, and the island would absorb what she had held back. She could be emptied of the compulsion to perform, relieved of the small, private, unbearable thing that had become her daily weather. The thought of such unburdening flirted dangerously with relief. Camille felt her knees weaken. For a trembling second she considered taking the offer. The island had demonstrated its appetite, had shown her the ledger's weaknesses, had provided a ritual and an altar, and witnesses who would not judge. The temptation was not grotesque, it was quieter than that. an almost civilized promise to be rearranged into something less sharp. But memory offered a counterweight. She thought of the ledger and the labor of documentation. She thought of Adrian's guarded eyes, the old woman's crusted bowl, the friends who sent banal messages across oceanic calm. She thought of how her solitude had become a safety she wielded to conceal fear. To surrender to the island would be to let that boundary dissolve in a different way, to exchange one invisibility for another. The choice was not between being seen and being invisible so much as between kinds of becoming. She inhaled. The first sound of her voice in the clearing was small, but steady. No. The word came out like a stone thrown into black water. The creatures made no motion of surprise. They did not hurry to claim her. The lead creature's mouth, or its approximation, curved in the faintest movement that might have been an understanding. It spoke then, words that layered and wavered as if sung through water. "You will carry us with you now." The sentence entered her the way a ship takes on ballast. It was not a threat of immediate possession so much as declaration. The island's claim was not limited to geography. It was a pattern to follow the person home, a weight to translate into other spaces. The idea that the island could not be fenced was more chilling than the prospect of immediate harm. Lightning cracked cullets of light across the clearing, throwing the figures into long, nickel-hard shadows. The air became acidic with ozone. The creatures fell back as the storm's surge crescendoed, as if the island itself made a clause in the night's law. Dawn. Camille watched them recede and felt a current of relief that was both relief and a strategic respite. The island obeyed its own timetable. Its appetite closed with the first light that would threaten exposure. She ran back through the trees with the lamp bobbing like a small animal. Her boots sank into the wet earth. At the villa, she flung herself into the room and locked the door, her heart doing a rapid, halting thing. The ledger lay open on the table, the pen still damp in the stand. She set the camera down and found that her hands trembled, not with adrenaline alone, but with a strange, profound sorrow. Dawn came as it always did, without rancor. Light filtered through louvers and washed the villa in the neutral certainty of morning. The cameras woke as if from a long dream and offered images of empty shore and the single set of prints that began at the waterline and led away. There was no altar in the footage, no pale creatures in the corners. The logs recorded a blackout between the exact hours she had come to expect. And then normality. Adrian arrived carrying coffee and the simple gestures of a man attempting practical kindness. He asked no questions about the clearing. He did not press her to tell him what had happened. He handed the cup as if he had not noticed that she had not slept. The staff, in daylight, assembled their explanations into a tidy sequence. Power surges, equipment failure, the heavy weather that could fabricate illusions. They made it respectable and small. A woman who worked in the kitchen said, with a softness that suggested memory, "People leave haunted here sometimes. They speak without words." She offered no more. It was the way people who live within recurrent danger speak of what they will not change. In the days that followed, guests checked out in trickles. The resort's bookings were pared back under the cover of storm damage. An insurance inspector came and left with an official frown. Adrian fielded calls with the rote competence of someone who had rehearsed crisis talk and learned to make a place sound repairable. He told her the island would be closed for a needed assessment. He did not look at her ledger. He did not ask whether she had proof beyond her notebooks. Camille left to catch a seaplane back to the city with a bag that felt lighter and heavier in equal measure. The island's agents, Adrian, the young maintenance man, even a softly smiling housekeeper, offered excuses and soft looks. The old woman did not meet her at the dock. A tidal swathe of people stood on the beach watching the plane lift like a private audience seeing one more act conclude. Camille watched the land recede until the villa was a fleck and then a blur. At the top of the plane's arc, she thought she saw a pattern along the shore, pale figures arranged like noting stones. But the clouds put a smear across the vision, and the pilot adjusted the descent. Paris was the city in which she had taught herself to appear complete. The air felt thinner there. The lights had a harsher edge, and the rooms were always slightly too full. Cameras did not go dark in a way that made sense. They flashed, recorded, rewound. Life resumed its old vectors. Lunches, messages, the droning commitments of friend and foe. She resumed meetings with a kind of practiced composure that belonged to an actor more than a person. Yet at night, the island's claim loosened and then tightened like a muscle in the dark. On her fourth night home, she woke to the sensation of breath at the window. Her apartment was on the third floor. The windows opened onto a narrow balcony, where a few pots of herbs turned dry in the city wind. The moon was a pale coin. On the glass, 3 small measured taps sounded, 1, 2, 3. The cadence was the same as on the villa, the rhythm she had learned to dread. Camille held her breath until the taps stopped. She did not go to the window to peer. She did not want to trade visibility for the proof of a presence that would then come into the room like a thing that had keys. Morning made excuses again. The balcony was dry. The glass bore only the faintest salt smear that might have been dew. The city offered her a paper with headlines she did not care to read. She made coffee and its warmth did not quite enter her hands. It was the ordinary gestures that felt foreign now, the rattle of the tram, a neighbor's dog, the hum of the refrigerator. Each small domestic noise she mapped against the ledger that lived now in her head. A week later she found wet footprints on the balcony floor. They began at the rail and moved to the door. They were long, tapered. They did not belong to anyone who lived nearby. The prints were damp enough to leave a ring at the edge of the parquet. She tried to wash them with a cloth and the water beaded and slid off them as if the salt in the prints repelled domestic erasure. Her fingers smelled of salt for a day. At night sometimes the sense returned that the air in her apartment catalogued absence like the sea did. Sometimes she heard the almost imperceptible scraping at the pipe outside, the faintest thing like a creature turning its head. She caught herself pausing in crowds, fearing that proximity meant a spill of recognition. She found that she flinched at late messages, imagined them to be bait. The ledger had become internalized, an architecture that measured the world into risk and rest. Months passed. The island's closure became a press release, temporary cessation of operations due to unanticipated infrastructural needs, management reassigned, further assessments pending. The tourism site quietly removed the villas from the booking page. A photo of the reef and a smiling manager appeared in the local paper with a piece on safety audits and ecological review. The official language made damage technical and curable. A PR team somewhere crafted images of bright towels and happy guests for a future rebranding. Yet Camille learned, with the bluntness of someone who had studied a wound, that official closures are often a performance. Some places keep a memory no policy can erase. She began noticing tiny changes in herself. A recurrent dream of stone rings, the abrasiveness of salt lingering on her tongue after a shower, the way water in a glass looked suddenly like a threshold. She would not say she was possessed, nor would she claim she was cured. She was changed, and whatever the island had offered had not been removed by distance. One evening she answered a message from the old woman. The woman had left a short note on a small postcard found in a shop. Been watching from the market. The words were cramped and mottled at the edges. The grammar of the message suggested little about intent. Camille walked to the square where the market took place and found the woman sitting by her stall, as if the place had preserved her as it preserved rituals. The woman did not look older. She had the same driftwood face, the same shell bracelets. She offered no apology for the island's hunger. "You did what you came to do," she said, not unkind. There was a tenderness in the sentence that felt like a balm. The woman added, as if continuing a fact about weather, "It walks with you now." Camille asked quietly if there was a way to be rid of it. The old woman smiled the smile of someone who had understood that not every wound admits a seam. She said only, "No. We only learn to carry what comes." The answer had instructions in its refusal. If the island's hunger could tag her, she would have to learn to live with its shadow. She could not be reclaimed by the place, but its mark could be worn like an ache that never quite healed. The thought was not consolation. It was a way forward, to integrate rather than to bargain for erasure. Sometimes in company she laughed like she used to. She went to events and allowed a practiced face to meet acquaintances. In the small hours, alone, the fear returned like a tide. The 3 taps, the wet prints, the sound of waves in the radiator. These became the private grammar of her nights. She kept a spare ledger, now more a ritual than a project. It was a record of persistence, more than proof. On some pages she wrote notes of gratitude as if to anchor herself, people who fed her when she had not eaten, a friend who came by and sat in comfortable silence. The island's claim did not make her unable to live. There were moments of unguardedness that felt like rebellion. One winter morning she stood at a gallery opening and watched the crowd swell like a tide. For a second she let herself be seen, without the ledger between her and the gaze. It hurt, in a way that suggested the island had taught her to be careful, but it was also an act of living. She found that living with the knowledge of a thing that hunted silence sharpened her sense of what mattered. Loneliness did not always require emptying. Sometimes it required company with people who understood not to pry. The island, however, did not forget. Months after her return, she received a photograph in the mail with no sender. An aerial shot of a thin slope of beach, palms arranged like sentries around a new sign that glittered in a staged way. The sign read, "Paradise Reborn. Book now." The image had been retouched. The water was a flat, impossible blue. Beneath the clever line, the booking link pulsed. The photograph had a small smear at the edge that, when she tilted the paper, revealed a faint salt trace. The island's advertising would not be honest, she thought. It would not show the ring of stones or the ledger's ink. It would show only what convinced new arrivals to come empty. Once, in the late hours, when the city slept and the radiator clicked like an old heart, Camille dreamed the island's whisper. The voice came not as demand, but as reminder. "You will carry us with you now." The dream left a residue that felt like a piece of string tied to her wrist. It did not tangle her, it was simply a fact she had to consider. She learned to answer the whisper in the only way she could, with a life that refused to collapse. She made small resistances, friends over for dinner, light left on in unpredictable rooms. A mattress moved near the window so she could see the street below. She practiced naming joy, even when the ledger clattered in her mind. Sometimes she fed the ledger with trivial things. Books read, conversations had, jokes shared, as if diluting the record of terror with ordinary proof of presence. At other times the island's claim made itself felt most unmistakably. A ring of damp on the step outside her door. The sound of water on the fire escape in a rhythm that approximated a knock. Footprints along the riverbank that elongated into the kind of print she had traced with her palm the night she left. These were not every night. They were not constant companions. They arrived like a tide, sometimes absent for weeks, then returning to remind her that distance did not annul contact. Friends suggested travel, therapy, detachment. She tried them. She found that therapy taught her to name the split between performance and interior life. It provided tools for relating to pain rather than letting pain define her. Travel offered new landscapes where she tried on different selves. Yet certain nights, in hotel rooms whose curtains she pulled across too quickly, She felt the sea lift in the pipes like a remembered drumbeat. Years layered, and the island's story became a rumor with teeth. A new management rebranded the resort quietly and then loudly, with glossy brochures, paid influencers, and bright photographs. The booking engine opened and closed like a tide of commerce. For every closure there was a new opening, replete with promises of curated privacy and restored amenities. Money and marketing could not, in the end, alter the island's appetite. They could only make it easier to hide the ledger's ink. Camille's life took on the tension of someone who has survived a thing without being able to name it fully. She walked through rooms in polite parties, and sometimes, in the small bright corner of a gala, she would put a hand to her throat to feel its thin, living secret. The world asked her to perform cheer. She did. The island asked her to yield silence. She fought back. Once, on an evening when rain tapped with the same patient insistence she had learned to fear, a photographer who had once pulsed cameras at her elbow stopped her mid-conversation. He lowered his lens and looked as if he had read a notice pinned behind her ribs. He said quietly, "You have changed." The observation was ordinary and true. She did not know whether to answer with anger, with gratitude, or with exhaustion. She said only, "I have learned how to carry things." There is a small mercy to living with the knowledge of a predator that is not moral, but geological. People adapt. The island's sentence, "You will carry us with you now," proved to be not a binding but an invitation to a different life architecture. Camille found that her nights were still threaded with the old rhythms. The occasional triple knock, the wet prints outside her window, the feeling of being catalogued. Yet she layered these with the acts of living: good breakfast, a call from a friend, a photograph of a dog that made her laugh. She kept the ledger but used it less as a weapon and more as a map she consulted when needed. The island, for all its malice, had taught her one sharp thing: that emptiness can be understood, and that being seen can be both dangerous and clarifying. In the end, what the island wanted was not merely bodies, but the space within them where silence fed. It had found in her a certain loneliness and pronounced it claim. That claim stayed with her in the way some scars do, visible only to those who know where to look. On a bright day years later, she found herself scanning the travel pages out of habit. The ad for the island had rotated, offering a new season's package with a discounted rate for early bookings. The language was impeccable: seclusion, pristine sands, curated solitude. Her finger hovered over the link for a moment, not in desire but in technical curiosity. She imagined the landing page humming politely, promising a quiet that cost money. She also imagined the old woman's bowls, the altar ringed with stones, the creature's layered voices. The images of the beach seemed to wear their veneer with a pleasant brazenness. Camille closed the browser. That night, when the city was a scatter of light and the radiator sighed its familiar domestic sigh, 3 precise knocks sounded on her apartment window like a clock learning how to be an omen. She did not go to the glass. She sat with the sound as if listening to the island itself make a small, patient note in the margins of her life. The sound was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was simply the island reminding her of its grammar. And she had, in some ways, become fluent. A soft voice came to her then, not through glass but through memory, layered and tidal and impossibly close. "You took the quiet. You will carry us with you now." Camille let the sound wash through her the way one lets a wave roll over the ankle, with attention and without panic. She thought of the ledger and set it on the table in the window's light. She poured herself a cup of tea she did not really want and held it like a small, functional thing. The world was what it was, a combination of hunger and coffee and friends, and the stubborn human work of making arrangements that did not surrender to the thing that fed on silence. Outside, in another hemisphere, a new guest clicked the booking link and smiled at a photograph that promised seclusion. The island breathes in its own time, patient and indifferent. It knows how to arrange its surface. It knows how to wait for people who prefer to be seen without being known. Camille set the ledger on the shelf and, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to think of names she might one day give to things beyond the island's claim. She would not learn to forget. She would not be freed of the prints that sometimes appeared where water met wood. But she had learned to keep company with the knowledge of the appetite, and to refuse that knowledge's desire to make her small. The ocean kept its old rhythms. Dawn remained a brittle truce. The island waited in photographs, in PR blurbs, and in postcards. Its hunger followed some of those who left like a shadow that would not detach. Camille continued to live in the world between light and night, balancing on the thin wire of ordinary days and nights that sometimes took the shape of old incantations. She kept her ledger, made new friends, laughed aloud in rooms full of strangers, and when the knocks came, listened and answered not with surrender, but with the persistent, ordinary act of staying alive. If the island wanted to feed on silence, she decided, then she would not starve it by giving away whole selves. She would not vanish. She would let life, loud and messy and human, press against the edges of the hunger. And in that small, defiant choice there was a kind of survival. Not triumph, not cure, but bearing the knowledge and walking forward anyway. If you liked this kind of slow-burn, atmospheric story, there's a playlist of similar tales that explores isolation and the uncanny. Watching them means you won't be alone with the silence.